clarity, a transparency, if you will, that might come if something came up in a range that the council be made aware of it. And I know that you're trying, in some of our purchase discussions, that you're trying to let the council know if we're in a block of monies that you're going to give us notification ahead of time, if you can, where you can, and if someone on that same notification, if someone on the council was party to that maybe that could be done ahead of time so that the council would know that that was happening. Those are the only two things I saw that could be done fairly quickly with not a lot of pain.
Mr. Keller.
To build off of Alderman Teresinki's comments, I agree that we need to clarify some of the language within Chapter 54, namely something that's we've discussed in this council before and I think is in need of revision is with regard to the spending authority. We have the $20,000 limit, but we have no language or any verbiage regarding the aggregate amount expended. So if something is split up over time, we have no necessary policy to say that if the aggregate is over $20,000, it will then need to be brought back to the council. So we need some sort of, I don't know what that would be, I'm not a lawyer, so we need to discuss that we need to discuss that in more detail, so I certainly think that that's a topic of discussion. But to build off of Alderman Baker and Alderman Simpson's comments, I do concur that to outright limit the ability of aldermen to do business with the city with it to a reasonable extent would be foolhardy, and that I think that there are several business people within this community who have served on this council in the past and continue to serve on this council who have valuable inputs. So I think that we would need to explore some sort of, again, clarification as to how that would go about in the future, whether that be brought to a full council vote and any sort of bids or anything of that sort, even if it does fall under the city manager spending authority. But I don't know. I'm just throwing myself at the pleasure of the council here.
Thank you. Mr. Gallagher.
So this is an interesting topic. There's some pretty specific guidelines and rules within the Illinois statutes for the state that get into it pretty specifically about municipalities as far as elected officials doing work with municipalities, and there's some certain numbers that are there that we may want to consider. Obviously, we have our own counsel that we need to talk to in this type of situation. I don't know how this all came about. I mean, I have an idea how it all came about. This is prior to me joining this council. But the way that I'm kind of looking at it, at least on my side, is that can aldermen potentially do work with the city? Well, you're walking an extremely thin, you're walking the fence on this one, right? And in a situation where you're going to make a vote on something that may benefit you from financially, right? Then that's a situation when you're going to vote for a certain project or construction project. That's when you'll have to recuse yourself, because if you're going to benefit financially, it's not, it's in your best interest to vote that way. So in this whole thing, the way I'm kind of looking at it, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, the way the events presented themselves last summer, over June, July, August, or wherever the events occurred, as far as how this stuff was awarded, and what I've read as far as all my backup material, is that we're working with the low bidder on all of these things, so we're trying to do what's in the best interest for the city as far as managing costs.
Just to clarify, the low quote.
The low quote, right? The low quote, and it doesn't present itself all together as 6 projects all at once. It kind of develops over time as these projects start to develop, as you're taking down buildings, etc. Correct?
That's correct.
Right.
Yeah,
so
the purchase and demolition didn't occur all at the same time. They occurred over a
correct.
period of months, if not over a year or so.
So I guess my opinion on this whole thing is that I think that from an aldermanic or from an elected official type of situation, I would recommend that what we do in our industry, and I'm a registered representative with the SEC, FINRA, is that we do an annual disclosure statement, very similar to the economic interest statement that gets turned into the county, but I think that I would recommend that any individual, an elected official here for the city of DeKalb, anyone within purchasing, etc., that they throw out some annual disclosure statement that's done during the open enrollment period, potentially November, December, for the city of DeKalb, and that will list as far as all of your business information and some other specific questions so that we know exactly from a disclosure what it is you actually do for a business, so that everyone kind of knows this, because someone would say, well, I don't even know what someone may do as far as another alderman, as far as their actual business. So that would be nice to have that stuff in a personnel file here, and that would be my recommendation. Annually, always disclose that information. So no ordinance, by the way. We don't need to change an ordinance. No, we don't need one more ordinance.
Yeah, I tend to be a little more conservative than maybe my peers here. When you started out with the state statute, it makes it very clear that any business done by an alderman in a municipality that is voted upon must, in fact, be disclosed at the time and probably, obviously, abstained. I would like to see something crafted that would do the same, that would mirror that, regardless of the price tag, regardless of the increments, regardless of the administrative ability that we have with our city manager, so we can do business, just to disclose it.
When it involves a council.
When it involves a council member. I think that the language could be written very simply, and I think one of you brought up the appearance of impropriety, and we know amongst ourselves that no one's making big dollars here with deals behind the closed doors. If anything, we usually err on the side of being conservative. And I just think that what might be a way we would want to go, because then it mirrors the state statute, as you said, Alderman Gallagher, and no one could say that we are violating the state statute. Now, I don't know whether that would get in the way of your ability to do business, and part of the reason why we have that administrative ability is to get business done, as opposed to having to wait 2 weeks to do this to buy a new snowplow blade, that kind
I'm
of...
thinking
I've got
something along the lines of what you're suggesting for the larger projects, but what about the $100 here, $10 there?
I have a solution. In business, if we do business with a company that thinks that we might be a sole proprietor and not a corporation, then they may ask for our 36 number or some sort of identification number so that they can make sure that that income is then recorded with the state and the feds, or available at least if they get audited. Now, what I just thought of while we're brainstorming here, the city could require, before it cuts a check, a disclosure from all vendors as to ownership, even if it's 1% ownership of that company. Are you employed by the city of Dekalb, or more specifically on the city council? And before those checks are cut, that might be where Mark was going. What about the $100 check? Well, I gave the example to one of the news reporters. What if I decide to go in the business of general contracting and bid some of this work next year? Well, maybe I'll decide to do that in January. Well, there's no disclosure necessary anywhere other than, I suppose, maybe I could run up to the county and redisclose it, but I don't think it's due yet. That would be a perfect analogy of nobody knew I was in that business. Maybe I'd call it ABC Contracting, and of course I would disclose it, but there would be an extra safeguard to make sure that it got disclosed, not just to the city, but a little memo could go around to all the council people so that we're fully aware if something were to come up that there may be a necessary, hey, don't you want to disclose that before we start talking about it, rather than getting down to just the bid on it or the vote to bid.
Mr. Baker, is that similar to what Mr. Gallagher is suggesting, an annual disclosure statement?
Well, it's just to add on to what Mr. Gallagher was suggesting, is that the city not be able to cut a check to a vendor without knowledge as to whether or not a city council member owns a portion.
So what you do then is you have a specific area that simply says outside business interests, and then you list any outside business interests that you have other than potentially your job as president of copy service. Then an outside business interest would say ABC company, and then it would say percentage of ownership in this company. According to state statute, right, if it's less than 7 1/3% interest, right, then you don't have, it's not really much of a conflict. But most of the time, as a sole proprietor, you're going to be 100% ownership on these things. So I think you would probably want to do that, Mark, include some type of outside business interest. So you have a working knowledge for some of these things that might be bid on.
Do you have some direction, Mark, that you might be able to draft something, run it by us, and we could give our feedback, and then it could be brought back in ordinance form for further discussion?
Yeah, I've got some good notes here, and we could put that into some revisions to Chapter 54 and also our purchasing policy.
Right, and that this gives us an opportunity to let him hear what we said, bring it back, then we can discuss how we want to move forward.